Hey, welcome back. I'm glad you're here today. So, we're going to read a couple more chapters of the miraculous journey of Edward Tulane. And if you were listening yesterday, you'll remember that Edward, poor Edward, had been used as a scarecrow in a garden by a little old lady who didn't seem like she was very nice. Well, at the end of the last chapter yesterday, Edward got rescued by a little boy named Bryce. So let's find out what Bryce does with Edward. Here we go. Chapter 17. Bryce slung Edward over his shoulder and he started to walk. "I come to get you for Sarah Ruth," Bryce said. "You don't know Sarah Ruth? She's my sister, and she's sick. She had her a baby doll once made out of china. Oh, she loved that baby doll, but it broke." Edward was being taken to a child to make up for the loss of a doll. A doll! Edward hated dolls, and to be thought of as a replacement for a doll offended him, but still he had to admit it was much, much better than hanging by his ears from a post in a garden. The house in which Bryce and Sarah Ruth lived was so small and so crooked that Edward did not think at first that it was a house. He mistook it instead for a chicken coop. Inside there were just 2 beds and a lamp, and not much else. Bryce laid Edward on the foot of one of the beds, and then he lit the lamp. "Sarah," Bryce whispered. "Sarah Ruth, you gotta wake up now, honey. I brought you something." And then he took the harmonica out of his pocket and he played the beginning of a simple melody. The little girl sat up in bed, and then she immediately started to cough. Bryce put his hand on her back. "That's all right," he told her. "It's okay, it's okay." She was young and tiny, maybe 4 years old, and she had white blonde hair, and even in the poor light of the lamp, Edward could see that her eyes were the same gold-flecked brown as Bryce's. "That's right now," said Bryce. "You go ahead, you cough." Sarah Ruth did. She coughed and coughed and coughed. On the wall of the cabin there was a lamp that lit her trembling shadow. She was hunched over and very small. The coughing was the saddest sound that Edward had ever heard. It was even sadder than the call of the whippoorwill. Finally, Sarah Ruth stopped coughing. Bryce said, "You want to see what I brung you?" Sarah Ruth nodded her head. "Okay, you got to close your eyes." The girl closed her eyes. Bryce picked up Edward and held him so that he was standing straight like a soldier at the end of the bed. "All right now, you can open them." Sarah Ruth opened her eyes and Bryce moved Edward's china legs and china arms so it looked like he was dancing. Sarah Ruth laughed and clapped her little hands. "Rabbit," she said. "Yes, and he's for you, honey," said Bryce. Sarah Ruth looked first at Edward, and then at Bryce, and then back at Edward again, and her eyes were wide with misbelief. "He's yours." "Mine?" Sarah Ruth, Edward would soon discover, rarely said more than one word at a time. Words, at least several of them all strung together, made her cough, so she limited herself. She said only what she absolutely had to say. "Yours," said Bryce. "I got in special for you." This knowledge provoked another fit of coughing in Sarah Ruth, and then she hunched over again. When the fit was done, she uncurled herself and held out her arms. "That's right," said Bryce, and he handed Edward to her. "Baby," she said. She rocked Edward back and forth and stared down at him, and she smiled. Never in his life had Edward ever been cradled like a baby. Abilene had not done it, nor had Nellie, and most certainly Bull had not. It was a singular sensation to be held so gently and yet so fiercely, to be stared down at with so much love. Edward felt the whole of his china body flood with warmth for the little girl. "You gonna give him a name now, honey?" Bryce asked. "Jangles," said Sarah Ruth, without taking her eyes off of Edward's. "Ah, Jangles, huh? Well, that's a good name. I like that name." Bryce patted Sarah Ruth on the head, and she continued to stare down at Edward. "Hush," she said to Edward as she rocked Jangles back and forth. "From the minute I first seen him," said Bryce, "I knew he belonged to you. I said to myself, that rabbit is for Sarah Ruth for sure." "Jangles," murmured Sarah Ruth. Outside the cabin, thunder cracked, and then came the sound of rain falling on a tin roof. Sarah Ruth rocked Edward back and forth, and Bryce took out his harmonica and started to play, making his song keep rhythm with the rain. Chapter 18. Bryce and Sarah Ruth had a father. Early the next morning, when the light was gray and uncertain, Sarah Ruth was sitting up in the bed coughing, and then the father came home. He picked Edward up by one of his ears and said, "Ain't I never!" "It's a baby doll," said Bryce. "Don't look like no baby doll to me." Edward, hanging by one ear, was frightened. This, he was certain, was not a nice man. "Jangles," said Sarah Ruth between coughs, and she held out her arms. "He's hers," said Bryce. "He belongs to her." The father dropped Edward on the bed, and Bryce picked up the rabbit and handed him to Sarah Ruth. "It don't matter anyway," said the father. "Doesn't make no difference. Nothing makes a difference." "It does so matter," said Bryce. "Don't you sass me," said the father, and then he raised his hand and he slapped Bryce across the mouth, and then he turned and left the home. "Don't you worry now. You ain't got to worry about him," said Bryce to Edward. "He ain't nothing but a bully anyways, and besides, he don't hardly ever come home." Fortunately, the father did not come back that day. Bryce went out to work, and Sarah Ruth spent the day in bed, holding Edward in her lap and playing with a box full of buttons. "Pretty," she said to Edward, as she lined up the buttons on the bed and then arranged them in different patterns. Sometimes, when a coughing fit was really bad, she squeezed Edward so tight that he was afraid he was going to crack in half. Also, in between coughing fits, she took to sucking on one of Edward's ears. Normally, Edward would not have liked this. He would have thought it was gross and annoying. But there was something about Sarah Ruth. He wanted to take care of her. He wanted to protect her. He wanted to do more for her. At the end of the day, Bryce returned with a biscuit for Sarah Ruth and a ball of twine for Edward. Sarah Ruth held the biscuit in both hands and took very tiny bites. "You eat that all up now, honey, and let me hold Jangles," said Bryce. "Him and me got a surprise for you." Bryce took Edward off to the corner of the room, and with his pocket knife he cut off long links of twine and tied them to Edward's arms and feet, and then he tied the twine to sticks of wood. "See, all day I've been thinking about this," Bryce said. "What we're going to do is we're going to make you dance. Sarah Ruth loves dancing. My mama used to hold on to her and dance her all around the room." "You eating your biscuit?" Bryce called out to Sarah Ruth. "Uh-huh," said Sarah Ruth. "You hold up now, honey. We got a surprise for you." And then Bryce stood up. "Close your eyes," he told his sister. He took Edward over to the bed and said, "Okay, open them now." "Dance, Jangles," said Bryce. And then, moving the strings with the sticks in one hand, Bryce made Edward dance and drop and sway. And the whole while, at the same time, with his other hand, he held onto the harmonica and played a lovely tune. Sarah Ruth laughed. She laughed until she started to cough, and then Bryce laid Edward down and took Sarah Ruth in his lap, and he rocked her back and forth, and he rubbed her back. "You want some fresh air?" he asked her. "Let's get out of this nasty old air in here. Come on now." Bryce carried his sister outside, and he left Edward lying on the bed, and the rabbit, staring up at the ceiling, thought about having wings. If he had them, he thought, he would fly high above the world to where the air was clean and sweet, and he would take Sarah Ruth with him. He would carry her in his arms. Surely high above the world, she would be able to breathe without coughing. After a minute, Bryce came back inside, still carrying Sarah Ruth. "Ah, she wants you too," he said. "Jangles," said Sarah Ruth. She held out her arms. So Bryce held Sarah Ruth, and Sarah Ruth held Edward, and the three of them stood outside. Bryce said, Yes, well, you gotta look for falling stars. Them are the ones that have the magic in them. They were quiet for a very long time, all three of them looking up at the sky. Sarah Ruth stopped coughing. Edward thought that maybe she had fallen asleep. There, she said, and she pointed to a star streaking through the nighttime sky. Yes, now make a wish, honey, Bryce said, his voice high and tight. That's your star. You make you a wish. You wish for anything you want. And even though it was Sarah Ruth's star, Edward wished on it too. Oh, I love that chapter. Those two children are so sweet, and I love how Bryce takes care of his sister. Just breaks my heart that she's so sick. Here's my question for you today. It says here in the last sentence of this chapter that Edward wished on the star too. What do you think Edward wished for? Do you have a thought? You know I do. I can't wait to hear what you think. Thank you so much for listening. Tomorrow we'll read chapters 19 and 20. This book isn't over yet. There's still a lot more story to it. Aren't you glad? I'll see you tomorrow. Thanks again for watching. Bye-bye.